You've been moving toward this moment for years, maybe decades. Retirement, the stage of life you were told would finally bring peace, freedom, and relief from constant pressure. The point where all the years of effort were supposed to come together and make sense. But now that it's getting closer, something feels different than you expected. Not panic, not obvious fear. Something quieter than that. A tension that stays in the background. Questions that don't fully go away no matter how much you try to ignore them. Will it really be enough? What happens if something changes after I stop earning? Did I actually prepare correctly, or did I simply follow what everyone else said to do? Those questions matter more than most people admit. Because you worked hard. You stayed responsible. You saved consistently. You avoided reckless decisions. You followed the plan exactly the way it was presented to you. So naturally, you assumed that if you stayed disciplined long enough, security would eventually take care of itself. But now, standing near the point where everything should feel settled, you realize something uncomfortable. Following a plan is not the same as fully understanding it, and that changes everything. Because retirement is not just about reaching a number. It's about what that number actually has to do once your working years end. How long it must last. How it responds to unexpected problems. How it performs when life stops following a perfect script. That's the part most people never think deeply enough about until retirement is already close. During your earning years, mistakes felt survivable. You could recover, adjust, work longer, earn more. But this stage is different. The margin for error becomes smaller. The weight of each decision becomes larger. And suddenly, small financial misunderstandings no longer feel small. That realization creates uncertainty for many people. Not because they failed, but because they sense that something important may have been overlooked. And most people respond to that feeling the wrong way. They avoid thinking about it. They continue assuming everything will somehow work itself out because it always has before. They stay attached to old habits simply because those habits once worked. But here's the danger. What worked during your working years does not always work the same way once active income slows down or stops completely. The rules change, and very few people are taught how to think differently when that transition happens. So they continue using the same mindset, the same assumptions, the same financial patterns, without realizing the environment around them has changed completely. At first, nothing feels wrong. Everything still appears stable. But over time, small cracks begin to form. Not dramatic ones, subtle ones. Enough to create tension. Enough to slowly weaken confidence. Enough to make the future feel less secure than it should. And that's why awareness matters so much at this stage. Because the difference between people who feel calm in retirement and those who feel uncertain is rarely intelligence. It's awareness. It's whether they recognize that this stage required a completely different way of thinking. The people who adjust early often appear different. More composed, more deliberate, more in control. Not because they necessarily have more money, but because they understand more clearly how to manage, protect, and direct what they already built. And that understanding changes how they move forward. This is why you cannot afford to ignore this stage mentally. Not because retirement is dangerous, but because unconscious thinking becomes dangerous when the conditions of life change. And if you continue operating on autopilot, the future slowly becomes less predictable. But if you pause now, reassess now, and begin thinking more deliberately about what lies ahead, you still have something incredibly valuable: control. Because this stage is not fixed. Your future is not fully decided. The direction can still change. The outcome can still improve. But only if you stop assuming and start paying closer attention to what truly matters before it becomes urgent. There comes a point in life when financial thinking must change, not slightly, but fundamentally. Most people are never taught this clearly. They are taught how to work, how to earn, how to save, and how to remain responsible. But they are rarely taught how to think once the stage of active accumulation begins to transition into dependence. And that transition changes everything. During the earlier years of life, the financial structure of a man is supported by movement. There is income entering consistently. There is time available to recover from mistakes. There is flexibility, adjustment, and the ability to correct direction over long periods. A poor decision, while unpleasant, is often survivable because there remains an active flow supporting the system. Time and effort work together to restore balance. This creates a certain psychological confidence. A man begins believing that stability will naturally continue because it always has before. And this is where the first misunderstanding develops. Stability begins to feel permanent. Familiarity begins to feel secure. The individual stops examining whether the conditions that once supported his financial life still exist in the same way. He assumes continuation because continuation has always been his experience. Yet retirement changes the entire structure beneath that assumption. What once relied on ongoing accumulation must now rely on preservation and management. What once expanded through active effort must now sustain itself over time. The system no longer functions the same way, even if outwardly it appears similar. But because this shift happens gradually, many fail to recognize its full weight until uncertainty begins appearing internally. This uncertainty rarely arrives dramatically. It appears quietly. A man notices that decisions feel heavier than before, that small mistakes seem more significant, that financial questions no longer feel theoretical. He begins wondering whether what he has built is positioned correctly for the years ahead, not because he failed, but because he senses that the environment itself has changed. If I were beginning again, I would understand this transition early. I would recognize that retirement is not the continuation of the same financial stage. It is an entirely different stage, requiring a different form of thinking. Because what worked while earning actively does not always work once active income becomes limited or disappears altogether. Many continue operating as though nothing has changed. They repeat the same patterns, rely on the same assumptions, and maintain the same habits that guided them during earlier years. They continue thinking like accumulators, even though they have entered a stage that requires management and preservation with awareness. This creates misalignment, and misalignment, over time, produces instability. There are many examples of people who reached retirement appearing financially prepared from the outside, yet internally they remained uncertain. They had accumulated resources, but they had never fully learned how to direct them once those resources became their primary source of support. They knew how to build, but not necessarily how to sustain. This is why retirement anxiety often exists, even among disciplined individuals. The discomfort is not always caused by lack of effort. Sometimes it comes from lack of understanding. The individual senses that there are forces, conditions, and variables operating beneath the surface that he never fully examined. And because he does not fully understand them, confidence weakens. In contrast, there are those who approach this stage differently. They understand that entering retirement requires adjustment. They do not blindly trust that old habits will continue producing the same results. Instead, they begin asking new questions. How must my resources behave now? What risks matter more at this stage? What assumptions should be re-examined? How do I position myself for durability instead of simple continuation? These individuals often appear calm, deliberate, and composed. Others notice a steadiness in them, not because they avoid uncertainty completely, but because they actively prepare for it. They no longer rely solely on what worked before. They refine their thinking to match the stage they have entered, and that refinement creates control. There is also another dangerous mistake near retirement that few people recognize clearly, assuming that past financial success automatically guarantees future stability. This belief feels logical because it is supported by history. A man has seen his system function for years. He has watched consistency produce reliable outcomes. Naturally, he begins trusting that continuation will remain automatic, but this assumption becomes dangerous when conditions change. What supported growth during earning years may not support sustainability during retirement years in the same way. Markets change, costs change, health changes, economic conditions shift. And because retirement reduces flexibility, these changes carry greater impact than before. Yet many continue assuming that what once worked will continue indefinitely without adjustment. This creates vulnerability disguised as confidence. The individual feels secure because the structure has remained stable for many years, but stability that is never examined eventually becomes fragile, not because it was false, but because it was never fully understood. If I were beginning again, I would never confuse familiarity with certainty. I would examine what supports my financial position beneath the surface. I would ask not only whether things have worked before, but whether they are prepared to continue functioning under future conditions. Because retirement does not reward passive assumptions, it rewards awareness. There are people who maintain extraordinary steadiness during uncertain periods because they prepared mentally before those conditions arrived. They considered variation before it appeared. They understood that stability itself requires management. And because they approached their financial life consciously, they were able to respond calmly when circumstances shifted. Others, however, trusted entirely in continuation. They assumed that because their system had functioned for years, it would continue without interruption. And when change eventually appeared, they were emotionally and strategically unprepared. The issue was not simply money. It was dependence on assumptions that had never been examined deeply enough. This is why awareness becomes increasingly valuable near retirement. A man must begin looking beyond appearances. He must understand not only what he has built, but how it behaves, what influences it, and what could weaken it over time. Because understanding creates preparation, and preparation creates confidence. There is also another subtle shift that must occur. A man approaching retirement must stop thinking only in terms of accumulation and begin thinking in terms of sustainability. This changes decision-making completely. The question is no longer simply, how do I increase what I have? The question becomes, how do I ensure what I have continues supporting me effectively over time? That question produces a different type of awareness. It causes the individual to examine details more carefully. He becomes more attentive to inefficiencies, more thoughtful about unnecessary risk, more conscious of how resources are directed. He begins recognizing that small decisions carry greater long-term influence now than they did during earlier stages of life. Many overlook this because the small decisions appear insignificant individually, a delayed adjustment here, a repeated inefficiency there, an assumption left unexamined. None of these seem dangerous in isolation, but over time, they accumulate. And accumulation, whether positive or negative, always shapes outcome. There are individuals who slowly weaken their own retirement security, not through dramatic mistakes, but through years of unconscious repetition. They continued spending the same way, thinking the same way, and relying on outdated assumptions simply because those patterns felt familiar. Gradually, the structure beneath them became less stable, not visibly at first, but steadily. In contrast, there are those who recognize the importance of precision at this stage. They understand that every decision contributes to the larger structure. They no longer operate automatically. They become deliberate. And because of that, their confidence grows stronger over time instead of weaker. If I were beginning again, I would develop this awareness early. I would stop assuming that retirement automatically creates security. I would recognize that security must be directed intentionally, because retirement is not an ending. It is a transition from building to managing, from earning to directing, from expansion to sustainability. And the individual who understands that transition clearly does not enter it passively. He enters it deliberately, with awareness, adjustment, and control. There is another reality near retirement that many people resist acknowledging because it feels uncomfortable to confront. It is the realization that financial security is not determined only by how much has been accumulated, but by how effectively that accumulation is managed over time. This distinction becomes increasingly important as retirement approaches because the relationship between money and time changes completely. During working years, time often repairs mistakes. During retirement years, mistakes consume time. A man who is still actively earning possesses flexibility. If conditions shift unexpectedly, he can often respond through increased effort, additional income, or strategic adjustment over a long period. But near retirement, flexibility narrows. The ability to recover from significant mistakes becomes more limited, and because of that, awareness becomes more valuable than ever before. Yet many continue approaching their financial life with the same level of unconscious routine they carried through earlier decades. This creates the next dangerous problem: operating on autopilot during the stage when deliberate thinking matters most. A man becomes so accustomed to his long-established financial habits that he stops questioning them entirely. Decisions become automatic. Patterns repeat without examination. The individual assumes that because things have remained stable, they will continue remaining stable indefinitely. But stability that is never examined can become fragile without warning. Conditions change beneath the surface long before consequences become visible. Inflation quietly alters purchasing power. Healthcare costs rise gradually. Economic environments shift slowly over time. None of these changes appear dramatic individually, but together, over many years, they reshape the entire financial landscape surrounding retirement. The danger is not simply these external forces themselves. The danger is failing to adjust your thinking while those forces continue evolving. Many individuals continue using old assumptions formed under completely different economic conditions. They trust financial strategies that once worked effectively without asking whether those same strategies still fit present realities. This creates hidden vulnerability. If I were beginning again, I would never allow familiarity to replace awareness. I would regularly examine whether my financial structure still matches the world around me. Because adaptation is not optional near retirement, it becomes essential. There are people who enter retirement feeling calm and secure, not necessarily because they possess extraordinary wealth, but because they understand their position clearly. They know how their resources function. They know what risks exist. They know where adjustments may become necessary. That understanding creates emotional stability. Others, however, avoid examining details because they fear what they might discover. They continue assuming things will somehow remain manageable simply because they have always been manageable before. But avoidance never creates security. It only delays awareness. And delayed awareness near retirement becomes increasingly costly because time for correction grows smaller each year. This leads to another major mistake: underestimating how quickly small financial inefficiencies compound later in life. During earlier years, waste often feels survivable because future earning potential remains strong. A poor financial habit may slow progress, but there is still time available to compensate for it. Near retirement, however, the same inefficiencies become far more dangerous because they continue operating against a fixed structure for years. A man may continue spending unconsciously because those patterns feel normal. He may maintain obligations that no longer support his future simply because they have existed for a long time. He may overlook small financial leaks because each one appears insignificant individually. Yet, over time, these patterns quietly weaken the stability he depends upon. This is why precision becomes increasingly important after 50. Not fear, not obsession, precision. The individual who approaches retirement wisely becomes more intentional about every repeated financial behavior. He begins recognizing that consistency works in both directions. Helpful patterns compound strength. Harmful patterns compound weakness. The direction depends entirely on what is repeated over time. There is also a psychological danger that few discuss openly. Many people approaching retirement become emotionally attached to the identity they built during their working years. Their sense of security is tied not only to money, but to activity, routine, productivity, and constant movement. And because of this, they often struggle to transition mentally into a stage that requires a completely different relationship with time, purpose, and decision-making. Some respond by avoiding the transition emotionally altogether. They continue operating exactly as before, refusing to acknowledge that their priorities must evolve. Others become overwhelmed by uncertainty because they no longer feel fully in control of what lies ahead. In both cases, the underlying issue is the same: lack of mental preparation for the transition itself. If I were beginning again, I would prepare psychologically as carefully as financially, because retirement is not simply a financial event, it is a structural shift in how life operates. And if a man enters that stage unconsciously, confusion and anxiety naturally increase. In contrast, those who adapt mentally often experience far greater stability. They begin redefining success before retirement fully arrives. They shift from constant accumulation toward intentional management. They stop measuring value only through productivity and begin focusing on sustainability, clarity, and freedom from unnecessary pressure. This mental adjustment changes how they experience the entire stage of life. There is also another mistake that quietly weakens retirement security: assuming that external systems alone will protect your future. Many people place complete trust in institutions, government systems, or financial structures they do not fully understand. They assume that because these systems existed throughout their lives, they will continue functioning exactly as expected indefinitely. But wise individuals understand something different. They understand that true security comes not from blind trust, but from awareness and preparation. They do not panic about uncertainty, but neither do they ignore it. They position themselves carefully. They remain informed. They build flexibility wherever possible. And because of that, unexpected changes affect them differently than those who depended entirely on assumptions. If I were beginning again, I would never surrender full responsibility for my future to systems I do not control completely. I would seek understanding. I would seek clarity, because awareness reduces fear, and understanding increases control. There is also the importance of continuing to think long-term, even near retirement. Many people unconsciously shorten their perspective as they age. They begin thinking only in immediate terms: immediate comfort, immediate stability, immediate relief. But this creates short-sighted decision-making precisely when long-term awareness matters most. The individuals who remain strongest financially later in life continue thinking years ahead. They consider future conditions carefully. They make decisions not only for present comfort, but for future resilience. And because they continue thinking strategically, they maintain flexibility even as circumstances evolve. If I were to express this as instruction, I would say this: retirement should never be approached passively. It must be approached consciously. Examine your assumptions, refine your habits, understand your structure, prepare mentally as well as financially. Fix this firmly within your mind. I do not drift into retirement unconsciously. I direct my future with awareness and intention. Because the moment a man begins thinking this way, his relationship with retirement changes entirely. Fear weakens, clarity increases. And what once felt uncertain begins to feel manageable, not because all risk disappears, but because awareness replaces assumption. In the end, retirement is not simply about reaching a certain age. It is about reaching a stage of life where your decisions begin carrying a different kind of weight. What once felt flexible becomes more permanent. What once felt recoverable becomes more significant. And what once could be ignored quietly begins demanding attention. That is why this stage cannot be approached unconsciously. Because the greatest danger near retirement is not always lack of money. Often, it is lack of awareness. The assumption that things will continue working simply because they always have before. The belief that familiar habits automatically remain effective. The tendency to operate on autopilot during the exact stage of life that requires the most deliberate thinking. That is where uncertainty begins. Not suddenly, gradually. A man continues following old patterns without realizing the environment around him has changed. He continues thinking like an accumulator, even though life now requires a manager. He continues trusting assumptions that were never fully examined. And over time, confidence weakens, not because of immediate failure, but because something beneath the surface no longer feels fully stable. Most people ignore that feeling. They distract themselves from it. They delay difficult conversations. They avoid looking closely because uncertainty feels uncomfortable. But avoidance never creates security. Awareness does. The people who move through retirement with the greatest sense of calm are not always the people with the most money. Often, they are the people with the most clarity. They understand their position. They understand their habits. They understand what supports their future and what quietly weakens it. And because they understand these things, they move differently, more intentionally, more carefully, more consciously than before. That awareness changes everything. Because once a man begins directing his financial life deliberately instead of automatically, control begins returning to him. Fear decreases, confidence increases. Not because all uncertainty disappears, but because he is no longer ignoring reality. He is preparing for it. That is the real purpose of this stage. Not panic, not fear, preparation, adjustment, awareness. There are people who enter retirement still emotionally dependent on old patterns, old assumptions, and old financial habits. And because they never adapted mentally, the future continues feeling uncertain no matter how much they accumulated. Then there are those who recognize the transition clearly. They understand that retirement requires a new mindset, a new level of awareness, a new relationship with time, money, and decision-making. These people continue refining their thinking instead of freezing inside familiarity. And because they continue adapting, they remain stronger than most people expect later in life. That is one of the most overlooked truths about aging. Experience can become an extraordinary advantage if it is combined with awareness. Because experience creates perspective. Perspective sharpens judgment. And sharp judgment, applied consistently, creates stability that goes far beyond money itself. If I were to express this as a final principle, it would be this: do not enter retirement passively. Do not assume the future will manage itself. And do not continue repeating old patterns simply because they once worked. Instead, pause, reassess, refine. Fix this deeply within your mind. I remain aware. I remain adaptable. I direct my future intentionally. Because the moment you stop drifting into retirement unconsciously and begin approaching it with clarity and preparation, everything changes. Your decisions improve. Your confidence strengthens. Your future becomes more stable. And most importantly, you begin replacing uncertainty with control. That is the real goal, not simply reaching retirement, but entering it with enough awareness, direction, and understanding to move through the next stage of life with confidence instead of fear. And for those willing to think differently before it becomes urgent, that future is still completely within reach.